Call to order a work session for Normal Town Council. Please call the roll.
Mayor Kus,
Here.
Mrs. Lorenz.
Here.
Ms. Harris.
Here.
Mr. Byers.
Here.
Ms. Smith.
Here.
Mr. Preston. Mr. McCarthy.
Here.
We have no public commenters tonight, so we'll go right to the issue of the purpose of this work session, and that is, as many of you know, and probably the reason you're in the room tonight is to deal with issues of gun violence and large gatherings that are causing a lot of concern for the residents in our community and for the students at Illinois State University. Similar concerns about their safety in that. And as I said earlier, and the council is totally in agreement with this, that we have to take action on this quickly to try and get on top of the situation and be proactive about correcting that kind of behavior in our community and taking steps to do that. So I'm going to turn this over to City Manager Pam Reese to start the conversation from staff. I will say staff has been working on this, and we're hoping to have a solution we can move on quickly.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor, Council. This evening, we want to take some time to talk about some serious public safety incidences that have been, that we've experienced this fall, things that really require immediate attention. The reason why we are meeting this evening, which is out of the ordinary to meet on a Wednesday evening, but with council's direction at the end of this work session, I'm hopeful that we will all be on board with bringing to you for action at your next meeting Monday night an ordinance that effectively puts in place some of these recommendations that we're going to present to you this evening. I'm going to ask Chief Petrilli to come forward. Chief is certainly our subject matter expert on these areas. We do have other staff that are going to be involved in this conversation this evening. But what we want to talk a little bit about with you and then get your feedback is the severity of the incidences, the things that we've experienced here in Normal, which unfortunately are not out of the ordinary in some communities throughout the country. But we feel it's time to basically have the line in the sand, a zero tolerance approach, and we have some strategies that we think can help us be more effective. And we'll get to that. We put a couple of bullet points on the screen just for council and audience awareness. We're going to talk briefly about some of the recent issues. Why are we here this evening? What our response has been and typical response from law enforcement and the public safety community, and then our recommended strategies. And then we will open it up for council to for you to ask questions of us. Give us your thoughts and your feedback so we can effectively come back to you on Monday evening with an ordinance. So I'm going to turn things over to Chief Petrilli.
Thank you, Ms. Reese, and thank you, Mayor, Council, residents, all my peers of department heads, everyone that showed up. I think it's really a testament to how we're approaching this problem. It's a community problem, and we need to bring all of our resources together to problem solve and come up with creative solutions. So just kind of a quick recap. I know we have a limited amount of time tonight, and I want to make sure that we have most of the time for questions, but a quick recap of the incidences that we're here to discuss. First off, the pop-up party just so happened on homecoming weekend, and we know homecoming weekend is a time of celebration and inviting people to our community, and that's what we want to continue, is that rich tradition of being a welcoming community and having people here. However, that night, things got out of hand. We had a very large group of people, both residents and non-residents, that assembled in our community, essentially took over a public park, Fairview Park, estimated about 1,000 to 2,000 people in that vicinity. There was numerous reports of property damage, open alcohol consumption, drug use, fighting. So it was an incident that the police responded to and ultimately tried to disperse. And when we did that, the crowd did disperse, but then congregated in other areas, specifically some of our local businesses. A couple gas stations in town had a huge influx of people that essentially took over the parking lot. And then there was some when that happened, that it obviously made the business put them in a position that the residents couldn't use the business, and they had to take some precautions at the direction of the police department. Hey, secure the doors, and let's try to work to disperse this crowd. So on top of that, some of the disarray that kind of took place in the park, I already mentioned some of the property damage that was prevalent. We had a lot of town cleanup that was necessary after that event that ranged from everything from property damage to cleaning up broken bottles, drug paraphernalia, things like that. And it really was just a situation that we're looking to avoid. And we're taking an aggressive stance in reflection on this of zero tolerance. We need to get to where as a community we come up with solutions that obviously involve the police department, but the residents, the business community, that type of behavior is not going to be tolerated in our community, and we're going to put systems in place to hopefully prevent that and or deter that from occurring in the future. The second incident, which warrants some discussion, was the gun violence that occurred at One Normal Plaza. There was a youth football game in that park there. The Twin City Tigers have used that park for years. It appears at this specific game, some tensions arose. Some people got very, very argumentative. I think there was actually some physical fighting happening between fans and coaches, which ultimately resulted in a firearm being displayed and then a firearm being discharged. Obviously, that just shocks the conscience of an entire community, especially when that happens at a youth football game involving children. So with these two incidents, it's allowed us to take a critical look at, hey, how are we handling crowd dynamics, number one, and then how can we, as a community, approach this so that it doesn't happen again, so that we can deter it and give our community, let them rest assured that this is a safe community and it's going to continue to be that way. As far as our response to a lot of these events that have taken place, specifically the large crowds, I'll address that one first. The pop-up party, which has been, that's the term now, pop-up party, which is not a new thing. We've had these for years. However, the outcome on this one was much different. We had a double shooting that occurred towards the end of the night with this one. Our response to that, we relied on our mutual aid agreements. ISU PD, Bloomington PD, the county, state police, everybody was in town. We all came together, formulated a plan for trying to disperse the crowd, to control the crowd the best that we could. But those mutual aid agreements, those are critical in those types of situations when we've got large crowds, and that's why we have those. That's why we have the equipment and the training and things that we ask for, so that when those situations occur, we can lean on our mutual aid, our training, our equipment, and try to work through those. When I try to drive this point home, when you're dealing with crowd dynamics and the police are involved, the options are very limited, right? We can try to disperse. We can request people to leave, which isn't entirely effective most of the times. But the last thing that you want to do as a police department is ever be in a situation that you have to use force against your own community, right? That's what we want to avoid as much as we can. So we de-escalate situations. We try to take every measure possible that if we've got a group that's assembling, they're becoming unruly, there's an element of criminality to their behavior, that we exhaust all the options before we get to that point, that we actually have to use some type of force, whether that be physical force and or a chemical agent, something like that, to disperse a crowd. That's not where we want to be. So when we're looking at options for dealing with crowds, I think getting back to the point of tonight is, how do we deter this from happening in the first place? Because nobody wants to get to that point to where the police are having to use force to break up crowds. So, but our response was one of a de-escalating nature. We wrote a handful of ordinance violations. We tried to deal with sound amplification issues, which complicate things in those situations, and ultimately really relied on our mutual aid agreements to disperse the crowds. It was a slow-moving operation in that respect, but ultimately was effective. But the problem becomes you're displacing that group. But that was effective for moving people from the parks. In the aftermath, attending the council meeting last week, we heard some concerns from residents on the One Normal Plaza issue and some basically just venting, I think, as to that, how could that incident happen in their neighborhood? And then it brought up some other concerns, everything from parking to just the overall kind of, I don't know, the mood in that neighborhood at times when there's large groups up there and surrounding the football games. So I took a group, mostly of my administrators and some of our community engagement officers, and we walked the neighborhood that Tuesday night after the last council meeting. And we talked with numerous residents, and it was a good exercise in allowing them to vent and kind of give us some feedback and hear from the community, because that's what we want from the community. We want the community to tell us, how do you want us to police you, right? They know best what's happening in their neighborhoods. Some people were frustrated with things, small things like parking, right, which can be big things. Other people were frustrated with the incident that occurred, but the overwhelming majority of the people that we spoke with were very welcoming of having the youth activities in their neighborhood. A lot of people understood that a lot of these kids don't always have options to occupy their time. They don't have structured sports, which can lend to team building and accountability and conflict resolution and things like that. So it was a mix. It was a good mix of that type of reaction from the community. But I think that exercise in getting out and speaking with them was a good thing. Was a good thing for the police to be walking the neighborhood and to hear from the residents. So it was a little bit of both, but overwhelmingly a positive response to having the football in the area. It was just the incident that occurred that truly was an anomaly. Both of these are anomalies that we're discussing here tonight, but need to be addressed 100%. The businesses, we have been doing business outreach now for a couple years. We started a business QR code program, which is simply a QR code that we give to businesses that they hang in their window. And when officers are out on routine patrol, they stop by businesses, they scan that QR code with their phone. It pops up a quick little questionnaire for them of, hey, who'd you talk to, what'd you talk about, type of thing, really with the ethos of that program being, let's build relationships with the community. Let's get out of your cars, let's get inside the businesses, have meaningful conversations, and that benefits everybody, right? We increase that communication line between the officers and the business, which can do nothing but benefit us in good times and in bad times. So that's a program that we have continued to do. But now what I've tried to instill on the officers and supervisors is let's go in and have a conversation of, hey, are you aware of what happened in the community? How would you handle that scenario if it came to your business, right? Because we understand businesses are going to make their own decisions. We're not necessarily there to be providing guidance on how they should handle those things, but at least we're having that dialogue, and it kind of gets everybody on the same page in that respect. And outside of that, I do want to commend just the men and women of the Normal Police Department and how they've handled these incidents. They show up to work, they work long hours. That's what we do. We're not looking for any extra recognition, but I think it goes without being said that definitely appreciate the efforts and the extra efforts, not only during these incidences, but we have made 2 arrests in the incident that happened at One Normal Plaza, and the active investigation on the shooting is an active investigation. Obviously, I can't go into that a whole lot, but we're making good progress in that as well. So with that,
Thank you, Chief. A couple things that I would like to add and highlight. Earlier this fall, council might recall some situations where we had much smaller, but some pop-up park activities. I remember council members contacting me over the weekend saying, hey, this is on social media, what's happening at, for example, Ironwood Park or Anderson Park. We received a couple complaints from nearby residents from some of those parks about noise and activity. And then the Parks and Recreation Department did expend very many hours of staff time trying to pick up the park space at significant expense of resources, staff time, and cost, in addition to, of course, the public safety time in responding. So those incidences had happened. The recent incidences that were very extreme anomalies, as Chief said, of homecoming weekend, those have basically, overshadowed, of course, our earlier fall experiences with park activities. So what we want to talk about tonight are what we believe are potential, basically tools we can have to help minimize the risk of these sorts of activities happening in the future. And I believe talking to staff today and even talking with the media, I basically indicated none of these by themselves are solutions, but as a whole, hopefully they can be part of our tools to minimize the risk of future pop-up parties and future very serious negative incidences. We've had conversations with stakeholders in our community. We've had conversations with Illinois State University, very much a stakeholder with us on this, in good partnership with them. Everyone we've spoken with, from residents to Illinois State University to basically the business community, everyone is willing to be at the table with us to talk about solutions, because it's not just the reputation of the municipality or us as an organization, it's the reputation of our community, it's the reputation of Illinois State University and all who work and reside here and call this home. So I think we're in a very good spot to have good conversations with folks, and with that, I think we're to the point where if council's ready, we'd like to start talking about our recommended strategies. Okay? So we'll just start off. The first thing I think at the top of the list is that we're all buying in. We're all on the same page in terms of zero tolerance, and what that means might be a little bit different to everyone. But I think from a public statement that we all agree that public safety, all public safety is the most important thing. And working together, we can do our best to preserve public safety. So that is our bottom line. With that as our starting point, we would like to talk about a proposed ordinance. So I'd like to focus the first part of our conversation here on the regulatory aspect of what we would need from council in terms of regulations. And then following the regulation discussion, we'll move on to the less regulatory matters, the more citizen engagement and relationship building. So I'm going to punt the conversation now to Corporation Counsel Jason Corsagrosa.
Thank you, Ms. Reese. And so I'll be going over the proposed ordinance changes that we're considering. It'll be essentially a two-faceted approach. And all of the bullets that I'll hit tonight, I think, are intended as discussion points. So nothing's set in stone, and town staff would welcome input from council on any of these specifics of these ordinances. So I passed out a handout to each of you. It's got two main bullets. First, talking about nuisance gatherings, and second, talking about mass gatherings. And these are two different approaches, very similar in many ways, but two different approaches to the two separate but similar problems we're experiencing. The pop-up parties on one hand, and then the misuse of parks on the other hand. And so the nuisance gathering ordinance that's under consideration, or will be under consideration, is really geared towards addressing the pop-up parties. And so what a nuisance gathering would be three or more people in which that gathering has certain triggering behavior that makes it a nuisance. It's what you would expect from a party or from a pop-up party: loud music, obstruction of streets or sidewalk, public consumption of alcohol or cannabis, underage possession or consumption of alcohol or cannabis, use of illegal drugs, fights, vandalism, open burning, littering, disorderly conduct, and then mass gathering at a park without a permit, which I'll get to shortly. The nuisance gathering facet of the ordinance would apply throughout the town, whether it's public property or private property, anywhere that three or more people congregate and then exhibit the behavior we talked about. And so the prohibitions would be against organizing a nuisance gathering, promoting it, hosting it, or even attending a nuisance gathering. And the penalties that we're proposing for this are pretty stiff by our ordinance's standards. Minimum fine of $1,000, maximum out of $5,000 per occurrence. Those fines would be assessed against any promoters, whether they're there at the time of the party or not, and any attendees or anyone that essentially supports the nuisance gathering. We'd also work in a cost reimbursement facet of it, as we experienced with the pop-up party a few weeks ago and other parties throughout the summer and fall. There are damages that happen as a result of these, and so it'd be our intention to seek reimbursement for those damages, including police and fire response, overtime, and the like, from the attendees or promoters of these pop-up parties. And so all of them, all of the attendees, anyone found at these parties would be jointly and severally liable, which effectively that means we could collect all of the costs from one or more of the people. And really, sorting out how that shakes out is kind of an accounting exercise on the back end. So that's the summary of our approach to the pop-up party issue, nuisance gatherings. Now,
Jason, before you move on to that, I did want to share, and we'll have conversation about all these details just to see how council feels, making sure we're going down the right path. The strategies we're presenting to you don't necessarily, if council buys into them today, doesn't mean that they would be permanent. These are strategies that we would recommend to make sure we get a handle on stopping this from happening again in the future. If things settle down and we find that these sorts of rules can be relaxed somewhat, council has the authority to relax them at any time. So I did want to just put that out there, that these are recommendations that we're not saying they have to be in concrete, but we are recommending that we come down with a very strong approach right now, because we've had these, again, incidences that are very just indescribable.
Absolutely. So we could sunset either or both of the facets of this ordinance when it passes. Moving on to the mass gatherings, again, this is more geared towards addressing bad behavior at the parks. It's a little bit different in that this would apply to gatherings of 51 people or more. 51 or more. And there's no bad behavior trigger on this one, unlike the nuisance gathering. It's just the number of people. And so that may seem initially draconian, but there are ways around it that I'll get to in just a minute. Now, this mass gatherings ordinance would apply to park property only, and we would offer that we would exempt sports complexes and pools, because those are just situations where it's very likely that there will be more than 50 people there. The prohibitions here, again, would similarly apply to any organizers, promoters, hosts, or attendees of a mass gathering. And we would also prohibit amplified music on the property, as we've experienced that's been a problem in the past, of loud music at our park shelters. Now, the exceptions would be town events. It would not apply to events that are put on by the town. So the town could have more than 50 people and amplified music as well. And then a mass gathering of 51 or more would be allowed with a Parks and Rec permit. If they go through the permitting process, there would be an avenue to allow larger gatherings. The penalties here that we're proposing are less stiff than the nuisance gathering, $100 to $500 per incident. And then we would similarly have the cost reimbursement hook through the nuisance gathering ordinance, because, again, if you'll remember, one of the nuisances, one of the bad behaviors that could trigger the nuisance gathering was gathering in a park without a permit. So that would be our hook for reimbursement of town costs in those situations as well. And so that's a general overview of the ordinances that you'll be seeing on Monday evening.
That's the regulatory side of things. And should we talk about that first before we move on to the
Yeah,
non-regulatory?
I think that'd be
Thank you.
appropriate. I think council has questions on that. And before we do questions, I think it's important, Jason, that you talk about some of the research you've done in terms of what other communities have done,
Sure.
especially university communities.
Yeah, so we recently acquired the MuniCode software, and that it allows me to search municipal codes throughout the country and also narrow by Illinois. So I did that in this situation, and frankly, the nuisance gathering, the initial ordinance I talked about, that's very common throughout large cities and college towns as well. In the past, I think an ordinance like that has often been geared towards house parties, and so there are sometimes limits that it only applies to residential zoning. But I think given where we're seeing parties go in this day and age, it's, the house parties are kind of a thing of the past to some extent, and it seems that social media allows these parties to crop up very quickly at any location in town. And so we've broadened that a bit. We've used the framework that other college towns have used for nuisance parties, but we're proposing applying that throughout the town. Likewise, the mass gatherings is not an uncommon provision to see. We've again tried to home in on the issue that we're experiencing here in the town of Normal with park rentals and not being too draconian in applying that more broadly than we need to.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to start with some questions here that I think we need to be very clear when we say 3 or more people tied to triggering behavior. I think that language has to be, it's not one or the other, that it's that. You know, I'm concerned about how that's perceived, that it's like we can't, I can't call my friends and have a picnic at Anderson Park without being fearful of triggering this ordinance. So I think we got to be very clear on the combination of the people and the triggering behavior.
That's right. Yeah, that would be the intention, is not just anybody with 4 people or more. It would be 3 or more and, you know, the bad behavior included. So I can make
And
that
so
clear.
my question goes to Chief Petrilli on this, going back to your comments about trying to contain, trying to de-escalate issues and that. When you find yourself in an issue where this is happening and you're interacting with these people and writing ordinances, do you see that as a problematic escalation that could cause something to go a place you don't want it to go?
Well, absolutely. You know, but there's numerous examples of people that have violated, whether it be sound amplification, open alcohol in public, things like that, that we've shown up, we've told them they're violating the rules, and we've gotten compliance. You know, that happens daily, weekly, every weekend, right? But there are situations that if the crowd gets too large, they're not interested in going along with our requests, then it becomes a situation, I think, that you're kind of referring to, that our options become limited at that point. When we don't get compliance from a crowd of hundreds of people and we've got 3 officers out there, our options become limited very quick.
Thank you. Ms. Smith?
So I'm glad you clarified that the triggering behavior has to accompany the gathering of a smaller group. I've got a question of jurisdiction, though, because we do have student apartments that are next to the campus, but not necessarily run by university personnel, and we have fraternity and sorority houses. So if there is a complaint that arises from a neighbor to those locations, does the call go out to Normal first, or does it go to the ISU police?
And that would depend on where that location is. Most of the things that I think you're referring to, most student apartments, most fraternities, sororities are going to be on town and Normal property. There may be a situation that ISU is called to a residence hall, or maybe a specific property on ISU's property. They would be the first responding agency, but being adjoining police districts like we are and our mutual aid agreements, generally we respond to those collectively.
And if someone is planning, say, a family reunion or a celebration, a birthday or a reunion or whatever, in a park, is there some criteria that makes it clear to them that they should be applying for a permit if they intend to use park property?
Yes, if a group is using a shelter, which ordinarily is what they use for special events, family gatherings or the like, on the Parks and Rec website, and the Parks and Rec staff is regularly taking reservations for those shelters, and they have an application form.
Because I do know that the shelters do have a signage that indicates that the priority is given to a group that has officially reserved the space. So whether or not somebody understands that if they wanted to use it without being bumped off of it, they do need to go through that. I wonder how we can best communicate that to all parties, because I know reaching people where they're going to read it is difficult.
Sure. Now, I can't say everyone that is in the park space or larger groups in parks or even everyone sitting in the shelters has reserved it. But, we can invite Mr. Damery forward to respond to questions specifically about how reservations are made. But regarding park expectations and applications and the like, we would promote that, be on our social media as well as our regular publications for Parks and Recreation. Mr. Damery, you want to refer to how parks are used and shelters reserved?
Yeah, typically, we open up reservations beginning of March, and we take them, start reserving April 15th through October 15th. So we really just limit that. That's when we have water running to the restrooms adjacent to pavilions, and so that's kind of the limiting season for shelter rentals or reservations, and we just give them a little lead time for that. There's a process in the office to reserve those that we go through, have an application form, and then we reserve those.
And this is for Chief Petrilli because it's not necessarily part of the legalities of the ordinance, but if you listen to the commentary at the meeting last week, there was some concern from the neighborhood residents that they had not had that community outreach almost immediately following the incident. And I know because I had seen some public relations pieces distributed by our communications director, and they were published in the Panagraph. But again, you come into the issue that not everybody is going to that news source for their information. So do you see that a protocol might be implemented to make it a common practice for the outreach that your officers did following the One Normal Plaza incident?
Absolutely, and that point was brought up to me earlier today that there's just so many channels right now to connect with people. And we did the old-fashioned way of walking a neighborhood and having conversations. And I got to tell you, I hadn't done that in a while because you get so used to press releases, social media, some of these other forms of communication that it really kind of brings you back to, you know what, there's several different forms of communication, and we need to make sure that we're utilizing all of those. But to your point, it's well taken, and we need to be more aware of it. But yes, we have people on the ground that do neighborhood meetings. We have a community engagement unit that's very active in the community. Now, we issued press releases right away on all these incidences, but not everybody reads the press releases. So that's something for us to work on and improve on.
Thank you.
Ms. Harris?
Thank you, Mayor. I do have a couple questions. I think these might go to Mr. Corsa-Grossa. I know that you used MuniCode to try to put together the framework for what you've presented. My first question is, like, under the penalties, there's two things here, and I wanted to know for clarification, will this be this and, so the fines on top of the reimbursement, or is it a fine or reimbursement cost?
Well, the way it's been proposed is a fine for the bad behavior and plus the reimbursement for any damage or costs that the town incurs.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And then my next question is the difference in fine amounts between the nuisance gathering and mass gatherings. Can you kind of give me some insight into the thought process on those differences?
Yeah, so the thought process between the two there, the nuisance gathering really is where we've seen some extreme behavior in terms of large groups of people, essentially getting to the point where the police presence is so outnumbered that I think the attendees are willing to take their chances getting a ticket. And so the increased fines there are as much meant to send a message to incoming attendees of these types of parties in the future to say that, hey, you know, you might count on your chances of being caught being low, but if you do get caught, it's going to hurt. And, you know, less so with the mass gatherings at the parks. I think generally the people that are doing those are people within our community, and so they have more of a stake in the community and are, you know, they're not, it almost seems as if the intention of the pop-up party is to behave badly in some ways, whereas the mass gatherings at the park, I think it's more likely that sometimes those just kind of get out of hand as people's celebrations or events continue on.
And then I have one
And
more
I'm
question, if it's okay. Oh.
Sorry, Ms. Harris, if I could just jump in and add a comment to that. Also, in terms of the nuisance gathering, the recent situations have resulted in some businesses needing to temporarily shut down. It's been that severe. And so that's why this particular ordinance applies to behavior on private property as well as public property, because there have been consequences that have been really detrimental to our local businesses. So if we feel like we've got a significant fine in place to at least make people think twice before they do that, that also will have a positive, hopefully, impact on businesses being less at risk.
Okay. And then here's my last point, and I think the mayor kind of started down a path, but it kind of ended before, to me, where it really addressed some things. And so it's probably going to take both of you to answer this question and think about it a little bit. So I understand the way we're writing it is more so to address some of the issues with the pop-ups that we've had. We say that it's not going to impede on someone possibly having something at their home, or as the mayor said, at like a park gathering with friends. But I'm going to be honest about something. I'm going to be very transparent and very clear on something here. I'll take Saturday, for instance. I myself had a few girlfriends over. It was about 6 of us. Luckily, I've lived in my neighborhood a very long time. Most people know me, so no issues. But according to this, if someone, and I can tell you I've lived in communities like this because I'm still one of few, if you know what I mean, in my community. And someone's like, I just don't, it's not like it's obnoxiously loud music, but I got music playing in my garage for us to hang out, sit out in the garage while we burn the fire pit. And luckily, you all know me, but I'm just one of many who might be like me. And somebody says to this person, well, I don't want them having their girlfriends over, and they call and they say that the music is a nuisance. Now, you all know me, so you would come and talk to me and say, hey, can you do this? But to someone who might not know, and not everyone is okay with sensitivity training, they'll get through it just to check it off the box. They go to the home, and it's escalated. How do we ensure that those type of situations do not happen?
And point well taken, and I understand exactly, I think, what you want answered with this. And I can tell you with our current system now, that same scenario that you're talking about could happen. We could have a loud music violation. We could show up. If we had poor training, we had unprofessional officers, and we had a systemic issue, then that problem would probably manifest into something similar to what you're talking about. I don't think this ordinance changes things in the fact that we're going to respond to complaints, but then we're going to assess everyone based on its merits, right? And 9 times out of 10 on complaints like that could happen with our current set of rules, we're just looking for compliance. It's a simple, hey, the neighbors called, the music's a little bit too loud, can you turn it down? Yep, no problem, and we're gone. So from that perspective, I don't see much changing in how we handle calls. I think what changes is some of the options from the ordinance side of things that really are going to be geared toward more of what the focus is tonight on the things when we say nuisance to me means a nexus to criminal activity that continues and escalates that criminal element of the activity. So I hope that answers your question. But I think I just think the same scenario applies now, and I don't see that happening.
So from a legal standpoint, what do you think would be our safeguard?
Well, what I can say is, what I've provided here is a very general citation to the behaviors that would run afoul of the ordinance. In the ordinance, I intend to actually tie it to our noise regulation, so it will be loud noises, loud music in violation of the noise regulations we already have in place, obstruction of streets in violation of other restrictions we have. And so I think, these bullet points read very broadly and seem as if they could be abused, but they will be tied back to other restrictions that we already have in our misdemeanors code or otherwise.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
I would just add to that. Now, I think your question was well asked and well answered. And I think the key here on this is the responsibility and professionalism of our police department, which I have high confidence in the training on how they respond to things and their ability with that first interaction to tamp things down, to cool things off, to have a conversation with people. And, in today's world, there are incidences out there where that doesn't happen. And so we're concerned about it as a council, very much so, and I know Chief Petrilli is concerned about it with our CALEA assessments and the professional assessments and the training that our officers go through. From the point that they're hired to their continuing training gives me more confidence in that we can manage that without this getting out of hand or without somebody being harshly punished when they shouldn't have been. But it's something that we have to be aware of, and it's a fair point to bring up, and I can guarantee you Chief Petrilli is top of mind on that issue. Where are we at? Ms. Lorenz.
Thank you. My question is for Chief Petrilli, I believe, in that could you walk us through the scenario of what happened, something like what happened with the pop-up party on homecoming weekend, but with this ordinance in place? How would it have played out differently? What tools would you have used with this ordinance to have been able to manage the situation better?
Great question. Unfortunately, I don't know that the ordinance would have changed a whole lot in that given scenario at the time. Now, I think what we're trying to do with the ordinance is create a system that truly does hold people accountable at a much different level from a financial aspect that makes it highly disadvantageous for them to do that behavior in the future. So could this happen again? Yes, unfortunately. But in that scenario, with this type of language in the ordinance, we would be very diligent in trying to find who are the promoters, who are the organizers, and when safe to do so, also who's attending. And in that respect, you're able to hold someone accountable for the activity. And that spreads quickly. When you walk out of a situation like that with several $1,000s worth of fines, I think that sends a pretty clear message that that's not going to be tolerated. And that word probably spreads pretty quickly on social media as well. So I wish that having this ordinance, I could sit here, Jason could sit here, city manager could sit here and say that this is not going to happen again. We can't make that promise, but I think that we have to be a little bit visionary in, hey, how do we put some systems in place, from an ordinance, from regulations, from process, to deter the activity. And if it does happen, that we've got a little bit more recourse to hold people accountable.
So then my second question, if I may, is having to do with how can we see these things coming? As I understand it, this one was pretty well telegraphed by some social media. I don't know how far in advance, but what are the mechanisms by which we can head these things off at the pass, if at all?
really that comes back to our intelligence gathering and sharing of information. I won't get too much into the weeds with that because it's more on a kind of a police tactics side of
Okay.
things. But what I can say is that we're constantly monitoring social media for all types of different things, not just pop-up parties. That's become the most used form of communication that we have. So it obviously is involved in a lot of criminal investigations that we do. But there has been, like I said, this is not a new scenario. We've had the big house parties of the past, where maybe they would write where to go on the sidewalk in chalk. Those days are gone. But we use that as intel in the same way, right, back in the day. But now we're monitoring social media, staying up on the trends of how these things develop. And then ultimately, like I said, without getting into things too much, one recently here that we used social media, we identified where there could have been an issue. We worked with some local partners, intervened on that, and prevented it.
Okay.
So that's already being done and has
Okay.
been done for a long time. Unfortunately, the incidences that happened on homecoming, we didn't have that intelligence that pointed us to a certain place with enough time to really
Okay.
intervene and prevent.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
That draws a follow-up question for me on this, on the ordinance writing and reaction. There's some discussion about the pop-up party that brought this forward, that there were organizers that were doing this as a for-pay process. Will we have language in our ordinances to address that kind of thing? And do we have the intel to find out who these people are that are doing that? Whether it happened or not, I don't know, but I've been told that there was an opportunity to buy a wristband for this event for a certain amount of money, and that kind of changes the legal scope of what we can do and not do, I think.
Well, to the extent we can use any sort of that information to further prove people were promoting the event or, supporting it in any way, that would be helpful. And again, the ordinance would scoop that sort of behavior up into it. In terms of, possibly using third-party platforms to facilitate this, the legal bounds of that are a bit murkier, especially when it comes to social media. Could we hold Facebook liable for, having a messenger app that allows them to plan this? That's probably not something we're going to bite off right now, but we can use that sort of information and that sort of evidence to support proving that someone was supporting or calling his party into town.
And to further answer that, sorry, Mayor, didn't mean to interrupt you, but we do have operational pathways that we've utilized to do exactly that, that we use officers in certain capacities to become aware of that activity, and we've taken steps of, seizing money, making arrests, things like that to shut events like that down. We've been doing that for years.
Thank you. Mr. Preston?
Thanks. A couple questions for Chief. Ms. Lorenz more eloquently asked a lot of the bulk of what I wanted to ask. But Chief, if I heard you correctly earlier, you had mentioned that for the pop-up party during homecoming weekend that there were a handful of ordinance violations that were written at that incident. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And so can you remind me what the fines are for our existing ordinance violations that would have been written in that instance?
So I think the ones that we had were the basic open alcohol in public. There might have been a fighting ordinance violation that was issued as well. And those fines kind of range based on past history, but most of those don't exceed a couple $100, right, Jason?
Generally, it's $25 to $500.
Yeah.
We've also got a provision in the ordinance that says, here's the settlement amounts, which most people kind of recognize. But we have the range of $25 to $500 generally.
Okay, yeah, so this would, certainly the proposed language here would significantly increase that enforcement end of it. What, for our current ordinance violations, sticking on the pop-up parties, do we have, or is there authority to focus on the promoting of events like we're proposing here for instance, if you guys, if you get some chatter online on social media, even if it's, same day, but earlier in the day that, hey, it seems like, a couple characters online keep popping up and promoting this, pop-up parties going to normal type of thing. Up to this point, have you been able to kind of, have outreach or, anything in advance for people who are promoting it? And second to that, should we pass an ordinance like being discussed tonight, is that a route I would assume that NPD in one form or another would do to try and kind of preempt these before they would begin if you do get the chatter on it?
Absolutely. That's part of our operational plan now. A very specific example, I won't get into the weeds with it, but just this week, there was another one that, once again, using some social media channels, we got ahead of something and kind of thwarted a plan of a pop-up kind of style gathering. And that's really where, we look for that partnership, not only with the residents, if you see something, say something, but that's where we rely heavily on the relationships that we're building with our business community. Because a lot of these parties can have their roots in, hey, I'm going to rent a banquet hall here, or I'm going to rent a block of hotel rooms here. And then you start to see some of the promoting of things on the back end. That's when we have strong relationships with our community, our business community, our residents, that usually we can leverage that to shut those down pretty quick before they even start.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. Byers, and then Ms. Harris again.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, Chief and Mr. Quirsigosa. Interesting challenge for us and the community. I want to go back to talking about a little bit, and Mr. Quirsigosa, you started to talk a little bit about this, and I might be asking you to go to one slice into the weeds, but keep me general if you need to. So we have existing noise ordinances. I know we had some issues in neighborhoods, and we started putting time limits and issues. And so certainly loud noise and music falls into that category, but this is a different ordinance that addresses that? Or can you speak to, are they different, and then which predominates, or are they layered and there's an escalation of a different type? Can you help us understand, are we creating redundant ordinances and we're choosing, or how does that all work?
Sure. So in some ways, this ordinance is slightly redundant in that we're tying it to this bad behavior that is otherwise citable. So someone could be, in these instances, cited for underage drinking or loud music or littering or what have you. And generally those fines, again, fall under our general $25 to $500 dollar penalty. Our approach with this one is to send more of a message that this sort of behavior, this overwhelming behavior, will not be tolerated. And if you attend or promote one of these parties, you're not just going to be on the hook possibly for a specific underage drinking ticket, but also on the hook for this more strict ticket for attending these gatherings where other people are also exhibiting this behavior as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, let me be a little more specific to maybe nuance this a little bit more. So somebody's backyard and 5 guys building a boat, making a lot of noise, annoying the neighbors at 9 o'clock at night. Are we using this ordinance, or are we using the other one?
Well, as with all our ordinances, there is quite a bit of discretion given to the police officers responding in terms of what they want to cite for. Again, not to pick apart necessarily the situation you've offered. Our noise regulations are specific to amplified sound and powered equipment, so it depends on, what's being used. But yes, to your point that, we are casting a wide net perhaps here and saying that there are certain behaviors that would fall under this umbrella. And I think kind of passing it to normal PD to use their discretion as to whether a group of friends in a backyard, perhaps, breaking one of these ordinances is worth the accelerated penalties of our nuisance gathering ordinance.
Okay. Thank you for that. So looking across some of these other categories, it seems like we probably have ordinances that cover some of these others as well.
Correct.
Same answer, I would assume.
Same answer, yep.
Okay, so a fair amount of discretion for the police department about power equipment is not a pop-up party in a park, and we're going to use these for pop-up party type situations, obviously.
That would be the expectation.
Yeah, obviously, okay.
To your point, though, and once again, kind of to your point, the ordinances exist now that we could apply those in those scenarios if we chose to do so, but that's just not common practice. And if we saw people deviating from what we considered common practice or applying some type of bias to the way that these things were being applied, that would be swiftly dealt with and course corrected very quickly. So.
And of course, if you're in a park within park hours, a certain amount of expectation of noise from a park is a reasonable expectation versus somebody's backyard with neighbors 10 to 20 feet away. So switching to, I guess, more of the ordinance is targeting kind of a regulatory punitive post part of the system. And you're working on social media channels to gain intel to preempt and stop. And I don't know if there is such a thing as a frequent flyer group or frequent flyer people who are organizing routinely or attempting to organize routinely. Have we thought about that? Is there an escalation for people who continually try to do this? Or is that even a concern that we need to address?
I mean, generally, my practice has been in prosecuting ordinance violations is that if I see a frequent flyer, that's when the fines ratchet up. And so that's why we often have ordinances with a range of fines, is that maybe a first offense is towards the lower end and repeat offenders start to work their way up through that range of fines.
I was anticipating that. I didn't want to lead the witness, though. Thank you.
Before I take any more questions, I want to say that, in a council meeting, we have a rule, you get to speak twice on an issue. That rule doesn't apply tonight. You can ask as many questions as you want on this, because we want this all out on the table. Mr. Byers.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. And first, thanks, Mayor, for putting this together on short notice. It's a really important issue, and I'm glad we've kind of swiftly responded and put this together, and to all my colleagues for being here tonight. And also thanks to Chief Petrilli and all of the men and women of NPD for all you do to keep our community safe. Just to share a broad philosophy, whether we're talking about disturbances at parks that are pop-up parties, whether we're talking about gun violence at One Emerald Plaza, or whether we're talking about the mass gatherings, maybe is what we're calling them, that took place around ISU homecoming, which also led to gun violence. These are all unacceptable to happen in our community. And my general approach is I would rather be over-stringent, overreactive than underreactive and undercautious. I want to make sure, and I think by the fact that we're here tonight, we are not. But these are no longer isolated incidences when they happen frequently. So I think that this is a pattern that needs to be addressed. And I appreciate what staff has done putting this together tonight so we can work to both be proactive and trying to prevent these things. So I think my first question, and these two questions will kind of go together. Chief Petrilli, you talked about how there were ordinance violations or there were fines imposed related to some of the ISU homecoming gatherings. I don't know if that was at the Circle K or which one, but I'm wondering how many of those were paid, or typically when you have an incident like that and there are fines, what % of them are being paid?
I would say the vast majority of ordinance violations end up being paid, and when they're not, they result in a warrant being issued. So most people just pay the fine and be done with it.
Okay. And the reason I ask is I think that having these stiff fines is good. I think it's a strong deterrent. But I'm thinking specifically to some of the incidents we've had, particularly some of the ones around ISU homecoming, where it was clearly at least several, if not majority of folks, not from the community. I mean, I could imagine $1,000 plus fine is given to them, and it's okay. Well, I'm going to go, back to wherever it is that they live, and try to find a way around that fine. And so, can you talk around that process? Because for me, it's important that we don't give out large fines if that's our intention, and then they're unpaid and it's sort of just a slap on the wrist. Can you talk about what that process is in terms of actually following through and prosecuting and ensuring that justice is served in those cases?
I think that's a question for Mr.
And that's fine.
Yeah, so, ordinance violations are fine-only offenses. Nobody faces jail time directly from the ordinance violation. If someone does not pay the fine, then that can lead to a warrant being issued, as Chief Petrilli mentioned. There's a couple steps along the way, but to the extent somebody thinks that they can just leave town and forget about it, that's not the case. The court will reach out and drag them into court for it. And if the non-payment continues and if the judge is not convinced as to whether the non-payment has been reasonable or not, ultimately people could face jail time for contempt of court specifically, but for non-payment for defying a court order to pay an ordinance violation.
Okay, and maybe the answer is it's ours as the town, but whose discretion is that at in terms of, okay, we have these group of people, they organize this nuisance gathering, where's kind of the line drawn where it's like, okay, it's time to go to the next step, they haven't paid? I mean, would we define in this, if you haven't paid this within a certain amount of time, we're going to take it further? How does that work?
These tickets will be issued and then handled as all ordinance violation tickets are. The legal department attempts to get 100% payment on all tickets, and so they will, the fines will be different, they'll be very different, but the process towards getting them paid will be much the same, which is bringing people to court. And, we do try to work with people based on their circumstances on how fast they may repay something, but ultimately we're seeking total repayment.
Okay, thanks. And then I think this can go back to Chief Petrilli, but particularly in instances where, I think they were talking about 1,000+ people at some of these homecoming events. I imagine that when NPD's responding on the scene, we're not able to give out, 1,000, violations on the spot. That's just too many people. I'm sure some people do disperse. But what I'm wondering is can you speak to the ability, particularly in instances where there's an excessive amount of social media evidence created, perhaps by folks that are violating these ordinances themselves? What is our ability to, or can we use social media videos, posts as evidence, even if we did not approach that person on the spot to give them a ticket? What is our ability to retroactively look through evidence that's been created online and then go find and identify those folks?
Yeah, I would think that in the scenario that you're discussing, that with an ordinance like this in place, that may give us the leverage to do exactly what you're discussing, is go back and if we need to identify people that maybe took part in an event that got out of hand, there was a criminal element to it, that we could, at that point, explore issuing violations based on once we ID the person and make that happen. But I also think that lends to, part of the deterrent with this and the follow-up and the fines, and I think a lot of it is also going to come back to that community education portion and the strategic partnerships with ISU, because we work very closely with ISU and their student conduct board, I believe is what it is called as it relates to ordinance violations. We've been doing that for years. We have information sharing agreements with them that they hold students accountable when we issue ordinance violations for open alcohol in public, things like that. So I wouldn't see that relationship changing from a cooperative, especially with something like this. So if we got to that point, we had a large party and there were some what we thought students involved, we could also leverage that partnership to help us identify and or hold people accountable if that was necessary in that certain instance.
Okay. And I think I know the answer, but I think this is for Jason. So let's say we pass this ordinance and these penalties. We can't retroact. So for example, we couldn't approve this on Monday and then now having new fines in place do what I'm talking about, which is go back to folks that have been involved in some of these incidences in the last few weeks and pursue these larger fines. I assume it's from the day that we pass it, correct?
That's right, yeah, I would be looking forward.
Okay. And the reason I ask is, and again, maybe I just spent too much time going down the rabbit hole on social media after all this, but I was really alarmed. Whether it was like the Circle K incident or some of these other incidences, the people that partook in those thought it was a big success. People thought it was really, there was a lot of social media posts. It was like, this was really fun. I mean, I didn't think it was fun. The neighbors, the people in our community, the businesses didn't think it was fun. And so I want to make sure that we are doing everything to be proactive, because my concern is this is going to happen again next homecoming. And people almost explicitly said that, hey, this was great. We're going to come back next year. So I want to make sure that we don't get into a situation where every year homecoming becomes a draw for regionally for people to come to our community and do this. And I think one of the only ways they're going to be able to do that is be extensively kind of pursue these fines against folks that break that law. So.
Thank you. Ms. Harris?
Okay, thank you. So I have some additional questions. Considering that one of the events dealt with children being, or youth being involved, which to me is more concerning than anything, and not only that it was dealing with youth, that a firearm was also involved. Could we look at the possibility of there being higher penalties? Because I'm thinking not just, we're looking at this one incident, but I'm also familiar of incidents, not necessarily in our community, but for some reason, youth competitive sports are becoming a big issue. And so my concern is if we're going to put something together, that's gonna be a deterrent. Whether it's for something like, what we just experienced, or a normal community or normal West game, whether it's softball game. Like I said, I'm even seeing not just here in our community, but a lot of places from AAU sports and everything, the parents are more competitive than the kids are. And guns are being drawn and things of that nature. And it's ridiculous. It's sickening, actually, to me. And so I want us to definitely send a message. I don't know if that means going back and looking at something even higher, if it is something of that nature, like there's another level to it. And especially any event that has where you've gotten a shooting event. That's just something I feel like we need to, take a look at. Any thoughts you have or anything you can provide on something, or what that could look like, or could we possibly do something to that magnitude?
And most of the time, the appropriate course of action on incidences like that would be using the state charges, kind of like we did in that scenario where we could charge somebody through the state statutes for possession of a firearm, reckless discharge of a firearm, things like that. That's going to be a much more applicable approach to that type of situation. I don't think an ordinance violation, maybe for some things that don't rise to violence, are definitely appropriate. But I think in that specific type of incident, I think the state charges is really where we're leaning and looking first.
Okay. And then my other question is, even as we look at both the nuisance gatherings and the mass gatherings, I don't know if this is possible too, because I was thinking about more of a tiered, if you will, look where attendees would pay possibly what was stated here, but organizers and promoters pay larger amounts because it's their brainchild, if you will, that this is even happening. Attendees a lot of times are just attending. Some of them may not even know that it's not. Case in point, listening to Councilmember Byers talk about people thought it was we had a great time. Probably assumed they had permits or whatever till you all showed up and realized that it wasn't. So while these might be good for the attendees, should we not look for something higher for those who are profiting? Because a lot of times, I don't see where we're going to take back all the money that they profited off of. They'll pay a small fine, but this might be just pennies on the dollar compared to what they profited. Could we charge them more to deter them from even thinking about promoting or organizing something that has not been sanctioned by the town?
Sure, I can talk about that. The fine range is exactly that, a range. Anyone could seek or could face the maximum fine, attendee or promoter, And some of those factors would factor into the decision-making on the charging process and the sentencing process. Ultimately, the judge will decide where in that range to find someone, but, you know, factors like that, promoting it, essentially bringing the party to town, I think would weigh heavily in terms of a higher fine. You could definitely codify that if you wanted to break out the conduct as, you know, promoting these bad behaviors is one fine range, attending and participating in it is a different fine range. That is one option. Of course, you know, as the prosecutor, I like maximum discretion. Give me the full fine range for these so that I can, you know, work with people on their specific circumstances. But that is an option to break it out depending on the specific behavior that someone exhibited.
So could we increase the highest level then? That way that it would incorporate that next level range if we needed to for organizers and promoters then?
Sure. Yeah, you could go above $5,000 if you wanted to.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Lorenz, then Mr. Byers, and then Ms. Smith.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of pick up where Ms. Harris left off on the, about the youth sporting event, but first a comment that I want to come back to. You said you'd gone on that Tuesday following the incident around the neighborhood. I actually talked with a couple of neighbors from that area, and they were very complimentary. So thank you for doing that. Sorry I didn't mention that earlier. Scenario here. So you have a mass gathering. You do all the things. You get your permit from Parks and Rec. You've got your 50 best friends. We're doing okay. It's a legal at this point mass gathering. Can it turn into something that can be prosecuted by the nuisance gathering? Because if me and my 50 best friends start to spill out over into Linden Avenue outside of Ironwood Park, does one feed the other in that way? So does a mass gathering is not illegal, only if you don't have a Park and Rec permit. That's, I'm understanding. So as long as I'm playing by those rules, I can become a nuisance gathering. Is that correct?
That's correct. So if you exhibited any of the other behaviors we talked about, or if you start to not follow the mass gathering requirements, that in and of itself, even without any of the other behaviors, is enough to trigger a nuisance
So
gathering.
if my 50 best friends and I have a party at Ironwood Park and we don't have the permit, we're in trouble right off the bat. No matter if we're having just good old-fashioned fun, we're still in violation.
Technically be 51, but yes.
Well, I said me and my 50. Yeah, so that made
You're right.
51.
And that's where
Anything
we
to
would
add?
actually, you know, expect a little bit of discretion to override, you know, an over-application of what this is intended to be. That if an officer could show up and found that somebody was, you know, ignorance is not an affirmative defense to
Right.
things. But if it was simply an oversight, I think an education component
Okay.
would override any enforcement at that point.
So if it's not, I don't know if you can answer this, didn't get the Park and Rec permit, good old-fashioned fun, not in the streets, no illegal behavior, are they still cited potentially, or is that a discretion?
I would say that's always going to be at the officer's discretion.
Okay, all right. The last thing I want to ask about, and this is the segue from Ms. Harris, back to that sporting event. I'm not sure either of these ordinances really address that, because that sporting event is a legal mass gathering. It's at a sporting complex. There's probably more than 50 people there, but clearly it got out of control. So what can we do to deter that? And I'm sure there's a lot of referees and umpires that would be eager to know because, you know, sometimes they have all that they can do just to, you know, kick the parent out, you know. That's what I remember from the era that my children were involved in that. What can you do if things are indeed, as Ms. Harris said, really getting out of control? What can we do to keep these events safe?
Ms. Reese, do you want to speak to that first? And then-
Sure,
okay.
sure. I'll start, and then the team here can jump in. That topic gets us a little bit away from the regulatory side of things, although at some point, depending on how out of control the activities happening at the youth sports, certainly law enforcement's going to step in. staff and the community and council, we are very, very concerned with what happened at One Normal Plaza. And I've spoken with leadership of the organization. They are willing to come to the table and talk to us and be good partners, which is great. And I think council has already highlighted what, the concerns with youth sports and competitive sports and what people are seeing at all levels with fan behavior, coach behavior, official behavior. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. So where we would like to go with that is more of the non-regulatory side of things. Parks and Recreation is going to lay out very clearly code of conduct expectations for those entities that use our park spaces. Mr. Damry and his team have already talked about laying out park rules and conduct, code of conduct, that they would then use to educate their coaches that operate our programs. They'd share, and we would lay out these expectations with all the users of our park space. We host lots of ball tournaments at Maxwell. We would expect the same kind of appropriate behavior out there as we want to make sure happens at One Normal Plaza or any other park. Shepherd Park hosts baseball tournaments. There's lots of things, lots of locations where we want to make sure if you're using Town of Normal Park spaces, these are the behaviors and expectations that we better be seeing. And if not, you will not be welcome in our park space anymore. So that's more of a relationship building and laying out our expectations from the start. Mr. Damry and his team have already started that process. It's not out of the ordinary. We just haven't had to be so put it in writing and spend time training everyone moving forward. But I think there's a useful reason to do that now. So that will be one thing. And then, of course, beyond just laying out our code of conduct and our expectations, we will be dialing up on our park reservation forms. We will be dialing up expectations as well, laying out there point blank on the shelter reservation form in terms of behavior. We will also, getting a little bit further away from the park space, but the neighborhood, we will continue the dialogue with neighbors. We've had conversations not only with residents close to One Normal Plaza, but residents in North Normal that experienced some issues with pop-up parties. So we're kind of commingling the neighborhood conversations, but this provides us a great opportunity to engage with residents and neighborhoods specifically, and talk about strategies when they see something, who to call, how to make contact with the PD, build those relationships as well. But back to youth sports, that is something that we can't solve alone, and it's going to take a village, basically. And so we want to start those conversations. And as I mentioned earlier in this evening's conversation, we've already started dialogue with other community stakeholders, and everyone is willing to be at the table and see what we can do as a community to be better.
So do I take that to mean that we're not ready or not at a point yet to put some consequences to bad behavior? So what if somebody doesn't follow the code of conduct that's clearly outlined in the park reservation form, and they misbehave?
Well, I think two things would happen. If it rises to the level of needing a police response, we're at the ordinance violation side here. If it's just bad behavior and damaging the reputation of the park, something like that, or causing disrepute, I guess, to the organization or the town, Parks and Recreation would then step in and say, okay, your entity, your organization, your activity is no longer going to be permitted in our park space.
So there's a ban. There's a ban, and then there's always the opportunity for somebody to call the police if they feel like this person's just out of control and making
Absolutely.
threatening. I guess that's just part of the normal course of things. Okay. Okay, thanks. That's all I have.
Mr. Byers and then Ms. Smith, and then Mr. Preston.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to be brief, and just briefly following up that conversation on sports events and youth sports. I mean, my belief, if you can't use it responsibly, you don't get to use it, right? And we could figure out what all that means in terms of nuance, but just at a high level, I talked about kind of the safety aspect of kind of all this ordinance, but just looking at it from a different perspective, can council speak to mass gatherings, just this whole ordinance kind of holistically as it relates to First Amendment, protests, et cetera?
Sure. So we did prevent or prohibit music amplification. We specifically did not prohibit sound amplification. For that reason, someone with a blowhorn that wants to exercise their First Amendment right, we don't want to infringe upon that. Likewise, I intend to include a carve-out for First Amendment activity. Obviously, the edges of that can get a little blurry, but I do intend to put that in there to allow people these public spaces to exercise that right.
Thanks. And then, I don't know if this is directs back to you or Chief Petrilli. I think we all know we have a national election coming up. My opinion is no matter what happens, we are going to have protests. And unfortunately, I think no matter what happens, we are going to have riots, no matter which side wins or loses. So I don't know how this ordinance relates. I'm sure we already have code in there as to how we address those issues, but just something that I hope we're thinking about that is going to be coming in the coming weeks.
Ms. Smith?
Just for some clarification on the fines and the reimbursement. So regardless of the number of individuals that might receive citations for participating in an event, would each individual be subject to a fine?
Yes, yeah, if we could locate them and ticket them, and to the extent we have the police presence and manpower to do that, anyone who's present at these and is participating would be eligible to get a ticket.
But then in terms of the reimbursement, that might require determining the cost involved for the repairs and cleanup to the park facilities and equipment and the overtime employed by the police department in responding to the call, the park personnel in doing the cleanup. And that would be some sum that would be divided among all of the individuals that were cited. Am I understanding this correctly?
That's right. Joint and several liability gives us wide latitude to go after one person for all of it, or many people for their respective shares. It won't be a matter of dividing the final number by however many people were ticketed. Everybody could possibly have to pay the entire amount, but we would not double collect. We wouldn't over collect. We wouldn't collect the same, the full amount from two different people. So once we are reimbursed, it would be incumbent on those defendants essentially to work out amongst themselves if they feel they have the argument to seek reimbursement from one another.
Do we have a preliminary tally of how much damage was done to the park in this recent incident over homecoming weekend?
We did do a tally, an amount. I did not bring that up here with me, but I could go get that if I needed to.
How many zeros are after it? 3 or more?
I would roughly guess we were reaching $2,000 plus for staff, man hours, repairs, that sort of thing. Yep.
And that's at that one incident, and you add the other parks that experienced problems in the fall and were up to multiple thousands of dollars.
Yeah, I'm referring really just to the Fairview incident.
Right, that one incident.
Specifically, yeah. We've often had 3 to 4 man hours or men out there for 3 to 4 hours after every single one of these events to get it cleaned up.
And switching gears to look at the relationship on the sporting associations, I know some residents made a comment that they were surprised that there was no security employed by these organizations that were managing the games. And I'm wondering if that can be part of the conversation, that given the level of tensions and competitiveness that are ratcheting up, whether or not that becomes an expectation that there is security provided by the organization to help assist the referees in controlling the parents and the players.
That certainly can be part of the conversation. I know in certain activities, certain sports, There are occasionally some security, some private security that are present, or they pay law enforcement to have a presence. Most of these organizations don't have a lot of extra dollars in their pots, but certainly that will be part of the conversation. Hopefully we can flip the script and everyone's on the same page and we can start seeing much better behavior. But worst case scenario, if they need to have security, we will talk with them about that.
Thank you.
I would think, given our previous conversation on that, if we found a group or groups of people that had events that raised it to that level, that required security, then we would probably ask them or tell them that they're not welcome in our parks because of the repeated activity that would raise the bar to require security. Mr. Preston.
Thanks. Thanks. I want to start by echoing, if I understood correctly, a question or a kind of a proposal thrown out by Ms. Harris in her last remarks, and second, the idea for nuisance gatherings that should it be appropriate, I would certainly be in favor of the top end of $5,000 range. That it's considered to take that number higher, with the understanding that discretion would be utilized, more for organizers and promoters, most likely than just attendees. But I think that going above 5,000, it only furthers the mission of what we're trying to accomplish with this in the first place. And to the point that was made, 5,000 may be a drop in the bucket compared to what's coming in with these kind of activities. And I want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to be respectful, of course, of people who, are not responsible for it happening overall and just kind of get caught up in it and be there, versus those who come up with the idea, put in the effort, throw it out to a bunch of people, and causes destruction in our community. I think that's higher than 5,000 sounds good to me. Second question, I'm not sure if I should direct this to Mr. Corsagrosa or to the chief, but on the nuisance gathering also, it discusses damage to town property. The nuisance gathering, should that ordinance pass, does it change anything with the private businesses and their ability to recoup, from specific individuals, thinking of like the Circle K, or others that may have gotten wrapped up and had damage themselves as a result of these activities?
Sure, it would not impede them from seeking reimbursement from any attendees or anyone that was culpable. We do have retail theft, for instance, ordinances that allows us to seek restitution on behalf of businesses. If someone stole something, we could work that, add that on top of the fine and have that repaid by a defendant. Situations like this that would be complicated with multiple defendants possibly being jointly and severally liable, if all of them were on the hook for damage to a business, it becomes more of a paperwork exercise and keeping track of who's paid what and whether that's been remitted to a private business, but that is an option.
Okay.
Mr. McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. Briefly, I want to echo thank you for putting this together rapidly so we can have this conversation out loud. And Chief, thanks to everybody out there trying to figure this out in the street while it's going on in our community. And I'm sure this is anything but easy. We appreciate your efforts, and you have our support up here. And staff as well, and figuring out what to do in parks that we never anticipated this kind of behavior happening in. We're just trying to figure it out. So I appreciate everything staff's doing and our police department. I want to, I guess I'll start with the end. I'll lend my voice for considering the conversation of raising the limit. I do want to some data informed if there's other communities that are looking at that and have done different amounts rather than just picking a number out of a hat, but some data information if there is out there of if people are specifically targeting promoters or organizers, whatever we're calling them, to make a greater financial deterrent. I'd be supportive in that conversation. And then about the parks specifically, I agree with the sentiment and the statement, bad behavior equals loss of use. So banning that is, I think, generally our approach so far. The code of conduct as a standard of measure, I think, is good. I'm sure there'll be some great conversations about bad behavior by a particular coach of a particular team. Does that really condemn the whole league? I'm sure there's conversations along the way to escalate that. I don't know how that will happen, but as long as we have that gray area in consideration when we're looking at code of conduct. I'm looking at you as the head of Parks and Recreation, because that's going to fall to your organization to some degree, and hopefully not Mr. Petrelli's organization. Hopefully not. But so generally speaking, I support that approach, and I support what we're looking at in the nuisance gathering, and I'm comfortable with how we're approaching this and layering it with existing ordinances. Appreciate the answers. Put you on the spot a little bit early with that, but so I'm comfortable with these approaches. Obviously, it'll be when we get the actual language and the actual ordinance, devil will be in the details, but generally I'm supportive of all this, Mayor.
Ms. Harris?
Okay.
If
I'm going to be
we're-
very
if we're-
fast, but I do want to say this because I know to kind of hit on something that Councilmember McCarthy said. When it comes to, I don't know if you know any promoters, I did promotion work for a very short time. When you're doing it the legit legal way, one of the things you have to have is insurance. So the thing about that is, say, let's just say for some odd reason, we get to this position and to an extent they did the right things, but something went wrong. Their insurance should cover the costs. And those insurances are quite a bit of money. Yes, we could probably, that's why I'm not telling them what to put for the maximum, but what I'm getting at is we should set a tone that this is not the place to just throw anything that can be damaging to our community and the reputation of our community. So, and to deter people who are not professional promoters either, because that happens as well, because that means you can't even foot the bill. But a professional promoter knows that you have to have insurance, and if something is to occur, that's why that insurance is there to cover it.
Ms. Reese, I think you had some follow-up comments.
Well, I kind of did, although I feel like I shared most of them in terms of, we've had great discussion this evening. I thank council for the conversation tonight. It certainly gives staff the right direction, so we can feel pretty confident coming in with a recommendation Monday night for the regulatory side of things with an ordinance, so we can get your approval and put it into place immediately. I think that's one of the most important things for our community to know, is we're taking action, and we are taking this very seriously. The other things will be ongoing. Our conversations with all of our community stakeholders, with those that we have partnered with for years that use our parks, with our neighbors surrounding our parks, with Illinois State University administration as well as students. We want to have good conversations there. So those conversations will all continue. Chief Petrelli mentioned earlier that conversations with the police officers, with his team, will continue with the business community. So we can build those relationships and help them continue to remain safe and serve their customers. So lots of good things will be happening from this point forward. Some things will just take time. The relationship building, the conversations, the neighborhood discussions, those are all the non-regulatory side of things. So I appreciate that. In terms of what you'll see Monday evening then, it's already Wednesday, you will be back here in this room on Monday evening, the 21st. We're going to start early with another work session on some very important topics then as well. But when we get to your regular agenda item or regular meeting agenda Monday evening, what you will see is a proposed ordinance summarizing what we've discussed here this evening. Mr. Cursagrosa has worked very rapidly in recent days to put his recommendations together. So I appreciate not only Chief Petrelli and his team, Mr. Damery and his team, but certainly Mr. Cursagrosa who's running a little bit light-staffed at the moment with one of his attorneys now becoming our HR director. So thank you to him for pulling all this information together. We will get your packet out to you as always by end of day tomorrow. We'll fill in the blanks with some of these things and hopefully we'll have an ordinance ready for you in a day, but you'll have it soon in preparation for Monday evening action.
Thank you. Just a few comments from me before we close out here is, this is an issue that's happened in our community, but I think it reached a tipping point, if you will, in our community in these last 2 weeks that required some extreme action on our part. And we have to be careful on how we do that. And I think this conversation tonight helped quite a bit to move it in that direction. But I have to say, as extreme as this may seem to some people, or concern and valid concerns for us to watch for, it's not near as extreme as the behavior we witnessed, where an individual was killed, another was grievously injured, and where there were multiple shots fired at an event with children and family. This is something we cannot tolerate in our community, and we have to be proactive on, and need to do that. If it goes wrong, if things get a little too much, perceived as too extreme, too punitive, getting the wrong people, as Ms. Lorenz talked about her closest 50 friends. We're going to be the first line on that one. We're the ones that are going to hear about it, us at the table. So we'll be watching for that. And, as a council, you're very responsive on that kind of thing if you hear about it from residents. And so that's going to be something that will affect us as we go forward. This isn't something that just 100% carved in stone and this is it forever. But we do have to take action. We have to take strong action. To emphasize what City Manager Reese said, stakeholders are going to be critical for this. For student apartment owners and for fraternities and sororities and that, it's important that we get the information to them and they get it out to their residents, to their frat or sorority members, and as many people. We can give them this information. They can react to it, but it's important that they understand what the law is and what we're trying to do. That's going to be critical. We're going to need that help. Illinois State University, I had a conversation with President Tarhuli on this, and his comment was, we as the university are 110% behind getting solution to these issues in our community. That's not saying he's putting a rubber stamp or a stamp of approval on this ordinance. He is with us, that something has to be done to turn the tide on this and to do something proactive to keep this from continuing in our community. So with that, if there are no other comments, I'd call for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Ms. Harris?
Aye.
Mr. Byers?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye, we are adjourned.